I just love this design, guys. I think it came out so pretty. It's obviously inspired by Vanessa over at VMD Designs. Be sure to check her out. I hope you guys like this tutorial. Let's get started. The tumbler we're using for this design is a 20-ounce sub-globe from Jen over at Nook-A-Lickle Creations. You can sublimate right on that white part and you won't have to seal it, but for the purpose of this video, we're going to go ahead and do glitter. We do not need the plastic part or the lid right now, so we're going to go ahead and shove that right back in the box. I do sand all of my tumblers before I go ahead with any paint, so I'm taking a minute now to go ahead and sand everything. I'm doing around that rim, all of the white and the bottom part. You're not trying to take off the color here, you're just trying to rough up the surface to give the paint something better to adhere to. Okay, now I have black spray paint that I'm putting on right here, but if I would have had a deep maroon, I would have used that. I needed a dark maroon base, and this burgundy acrylic paint right here was just too light. The black did help darken it up. I did not want to put the maroon glitter straight over this black just in case it had any type of flash to it. I didn't want to give it have any funky colors come off of it. So we're going to mix our epoxy and put our glitter right over it. The glitter is called Miss Pibb from By Firefly. It is a gorgeous maroon glitter. It does have a few different shades that it throws off, but it's really, really pretty. So we're going to go ahead and smooth that epoxy on in a really thin layer. When you get up to that rim right there, we're going to kind of wedge some epoxy under that, but we don't want it to come out thick at all. We need to be able to fit that plastic over it. So this is where I have my heat gun, and I'm using my finger to go ahead and spread it under there and make sure it's in nice thin coats. The glitter that we're using is called Miss Pibb from By Firefly. It is a gorgeous maroon glitter. We're going to go ahead and lay that all over the tumbler. It doesn't have to be super thick, but you do want nice coverage for it. Make sure you get that rim and the bottom of your tumbler. Once you have your glitter down, we're going to take parchment paper. I like to make sure it's pulled tight right there, wedge it under that little lip, and make sure all of that glitter is laid down under that little lip, as well as on all the edges and the bottom of the tumbler. You want to be sure that your plastic piece is going to fit back on there, and if it's too thick, then it won't. It'll get in the way. Once we have that down and it's dried, we're going to go ahead and set some epoxy and get the leaves on here. We just want a thin layer for this epoxy because we do need that plastic part to fit over it. Take your paintbrush, use your heat gun, and go ahead and get your epoxy and wedge it under that lip, but make sure it goes down in thin coats. I like to sprinkle these leaves on here instead of just letting them come out of the shaker or that little baggie so they don't go on too thick. So I just sprinkle a little around the bottoms. I ombre it sort of with my hand towards the top. I find that a silicone tool is especially helpful for this. That way, if any leaves are stuck together, I can go ahead and slide them off of each other or reposition them without them getting stuck to anything else. And then we're going to flip it over and put some leaves on the bottom as well. Once everything is in place, I very, very lightly use my heat gun to help that epoxy soak those leaves right in so they lay down a little flat. Don't use too much heat or you will curl up those leaves, so be careful. Let that cure, and then we're going to go ahead and give it another coat of epoxy to make sure that everything is sealed nice and the solution that we're going to use won't mess with the loose glitter. Once again, I have my heat gun to help thin out that epoxy. That way I can grab this paintbrush and again push the epoxy in there so that it's all the way sealed very, very thin and lightly. Take your torch, pop any bubbles, and then you're done. For this step, we need to make sure that this acrylic is going to fit. The epoxy does end up getting a little thick in there, so if you take a heat gun and just twirl it in circles, you can loosen it up just enough to scrape it out with a craft knife. These tumblers are really, really easy. They give you a lot of room to just pull that right out, but some tumblers aren't so forgiving, so be very careful at the beginning of how much epoxy that you're putting in there. Once it's cleaned, we're going to go on with a test run. It does fit. Be careful testing this out and make sure you don't scrape the inside of that plastic. To seal this together, we're going to use epoxy. I'm using a fast setting epoxy. I'm going to pour that right into that lip. I went about halfway, maybe just under halfway. Be careful how much epoxy you're putting in here because if you put too much, you will see it through the plastic. It will, kind of fill up a little deep. So do a little less than halfway and you should be fine. I have a dry baby wipe with some rubbing alcohol. I'm cleaning up any epoxy that may have gotten onto the tumbler. Have my heat gun to thin it out just a little. I'm going to spin it in circles to make sure it's level. Let it sit there for a few minutes. Torch to pop any bubbles, and then very gently put that acrylic on. You don't want to scratch, like I said earlier, you don't want to scratch that the inside of that acrylic, so just carefully put it on, press it down real good, and then I pick up the whole thing and I twirl it in circles to make sure that the inside of this acrylic is all the way coated. Once I'm happy with that and I know that it's all the way around, I put it down on the table again, press it one more time to make sure it's on there. I have my napkin with alcohol with this step to go ahead and clean up anything that may have dripped outside of the tumbler or on that acrylic. At this point, before it sets, rubbing alcohol will take it right off. Do not use acetone. You will mess up that plastic. To clean up the rim, I just have my craft knife. I put it on an angle, went around and cleaned it, and then I used acetone on the stainless. Make sure that, like I said, the acetone doesn't touch the plastic. Okay, so all the bad words I said for this part. I'm very, very visual. So what I have right here is I cut the leaves that I'm going to be using out with paper. I did run it through my Cricut so it would cut it, but I don't know, my Cricut, I couldn't get the setting right. It wouldn't cut through paper, guys. So I'm just really roughly kind of cutting along the edges of those shapes to give me the shape I need. I'm going to tape those to my tumbler so I can get an idea of the placement and sizes. I will have all the sizes that I cut everything to down in the description, so check that if you want to know the sizes that I did cut the leaves, because I made everything much, much larger than I'm taping to my cup right here. Once everything was in place and I adjusted everything on Cricut, I went ahead with what I use as a stencil vinyl. It's just Duck Brand shelf liner. It doesn't leave a residue and it removes easy. It's really great to work with. So this little bubbly part that you see that's sort of long in the middle, the non-leaf shape that I'm messing with right now, that is the offset of the wording that I'm going to use. I'm going to put this down first just as a place marker. That way I can put all my leaves around it and I'll have a clean space kind of marked off for where my wording is going to be with just a white background. Once I'm happy with that placement, I'm going to go ahead and start putting my leaves down. Those leaves in the background just now I didn't end up using. I cut them even bigger than what I had. Like I said, that's listed below. One at a time, I'm just going to remove that leaf and replace it with the same size, well, not the same size, but the leaf that it's supposed to be. I did kind of tilt these in different angles than what I originally had that little paper laid down right there, but it, like I said, the stuff is easy to work with, so you could just easily remove it and lay it down in place. Once I was happy with all the leaves, I went ahead and removed that little offset of the wording that I had that was marking the place of where it actually needs to go. Next, I'm taking electrical tape and I'm just going around that top rim of that glitter that was already done so that spray paint doesn't get on there. I didn't do a super thick layer of epoxy right there because I didn't want a giant bubble, so I want to make sure that's protected. I am also going to take this electrical tape and wrap it really well along the bottom to make sure the bottom, especially that hole, is all covered up. I didn't show the part where I put a piece of blue tape over, but you'll see some blue tape over that complete inside part. Once I had that electrical tape in place, I ran ahead and ran that around with my cup edging tool to make sure I'm going to have a straight line. Like I said, you cannot use acetone against that stainless, so I need to make sure that everything was going to be straight and covered up before I get to the spray paint part. We're giving this thing a really light coat of white spray paint, let it dry completely, and then we're going on with our maroon. Again, I would have used maroon spray paint, didn't have it, so I'm doing 2 layers of this burgundy acrylic. We're going to do this only on the ends, let it dry completely, and then we have our UV resin. We need to make sure we know where those little decals are that we need to pull up. So I'm doing 1 little drop of it, cure it with the light, find the next little sticker, cure it with the light, and keep going. I want to make sure that all the shapes of these leaves are marked so that they're going to be really easy to find. We're going to take it outside and brighten up that white inside part and also ombre the spray paint down. I find that if you take your time with light coats and just spray against that line, the overspray will help ombre itself. We're mixing up our fast cure epoxy, and then we're going to go ahead and remove our tape up at the top. I was pulling it and realized that some of the template overlaid, so I have my craft knife and I'm going around and I'm cutting it right there. That also helps that if you're using an acrylic paint, that the acrylic paint won't want to pull. It did give me a giant rip, but I'm actually not worried about that because I'm able to cover it up with some glitter. So I'm running my craft knife along the top and bottom to make sure I get a clean seam. After that, we're going to remove the tape from that top part, clean it up with some acetone, make sure we have any overspray that may have gotten under that, just go ahead and cleaned up, and then we're going to start with getting our epoxy down. This just needs a super thin coat of epoxy. It's just enough to get your glitter to adhere to it, so don't go crazy on this step. I have Miss Pib right here, and although I do have some glitter already on that top part, I'm sprinkling some on again just to play it off and help it tie in the rest of the design. I'm going to hold it at an angle, let that ombre down, and do the same thing at the bottom. Give myself a little line and then tilt it again and let it ombre up the tumbler. I do wish I would have made this maroon go slightly higher, but that's not even all that big of a deal. This chunky glitter that I'm using is called Mimosa by FeatherBear, but they're not around anymore, so I'm working on a little fall collection for you guys with By Firefly. And then we're just going to go on with our hand and just sprinkle it on. I have a lot more control when I pinch on that glitter with my hand and kind of sprinkle it on than if I use the shaker, so we're going to go that route. I noticed that a few pieces along that maroon weren't wanting to stick, so I grabbed this parchment paper and I'm laying down that maroon a little, and then I'm going to sprinkle some more of that chunky on there, and that definitely grabbed on a lot better. Once I was happy with that, I have It's Fall Y'all, also from FeatherBear, and I'm going to sprinkle that on by hand just like I did the other one. I did take my parchment paper here as well, laid some down to make sure that I wouldn't have any issues, and I could also stick that onto that pretty maroon section. I then took Graceful from By Firefly, sprinkled it in the middle, then tilted my tumbler up and down to make sure that it ombre'd down. This color is really pretty. After that, take your parchment paper, smush everything down. You want to make sure that it's laying really flat and everything's going to be easy and nice for the next coat of epoxy to lay on. Next, it's time to go ahead and remove all of these stencils. It's really easy to find since I put down that UV resin. I have this weeding pen that I'm gently going against the vinyl and lifting it up. You don't want to go too aggressive with this because you do have a chance of scratching that acrylic, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So go through, take your time, remove it all. You'll see in that first leaf, you'll see it later on, that I did miss a spot, but I was able to adjust that leaf with my vinyl that I'm laying down at the very end, and it covered it right up. So no big deal there for anything being lost. Once all of that was removed, I went ahead and took my dry baby wipe with some rubbing alcohol on it, and I cleaned up inside some of those areas that may have been an issue. Some of that acrylic paint, the maroon, did get under that, and I wanted to make sure that was going to be really clean. Also remove the tape at the bottom and let this layer of epoxy sit and completely cure. Once that was done, I went ahead and mixed up my next batch of Fast Cure epoxy and got that on the tumbler. We're just going to do a light coat for this. The vinyl that we're using is super forgiving, so we don't have to go completely crazy with this coat. We definitely don't want anything thick. So just get a nice even coat on there, torch to pop any bubbles, and then as always, I take my dry baby wipe with rubbing alcohol and I go along the rim of my tumbler to get anything that may have spilled over, and then also I do the bottom edge of my tumbler. Again, this Cricut textured vinyl is super forgiving. This is going to be the outline of all of our leaves and then the main wording. So go ahead and do these leaves, weed them, get them on your tumbler just one at a time. Take your time. The one thing I can tell you that's a great thing with this vinyl is that with it being so forgiving, you can actually cut this vinyl in some sections and then reattach it. Like even if you were making a complete straight line, you could cut it and then lay that vinyl right back down. You wouldn't even be able to tell that it was cut in certain sections. So that's really helpful for this because there were some areas with it being a big decal and kind of curving around the tumbler. I did have to play with it a little, lift it up, remove it, cut some sections and realign it. And it was really easy to play off. Time to do the wording. We're going to lay that right over here. Like I said, since it is a textured vinyl, super forgiving, you won't be able to tell, even with that maroon back there as an offset, because the offset that I did was like 0.003. So we're going to go ahead and get this all weeded, layered right here on our Cricut mat to make our lives just a little bit easier, and then we will transfer it right to our tumbler. We have that white spot marked out perfectly from earlier where we held that place with the vinyl, so we know right where to put it. And guys, I just love this saying, nothing changes if nothing changes. It's so real and probably a reminder that I don't want to hear sometimes. So I was doing my final little check on this before I go with epoxy, and I realized that that is where part of my vinyl stayed on there, part of my stencil stayed on there. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this, and you can see exactly how forgiving it is with the way I finished off this leaf. You really can't even tell that I had kind of had to like bandage it up and reshape the leaf. The other thing with this design is that since there's glitter kind of scattered randomly throughout it, that if you needed to kind of cover up a little spot, I mean, I'm not going to throw a ton of glitter right there, but to piece this together, if something didn't play off as nicely as it needs to, you can always add a stray glitter right there and drop a few stray ones around to keep with that kind of random theme. And it really helps to just play off that whole oopsie part of the design. Also, I forgot to say that I did give the tumbler a light sand before I did any decal work. I find that my decals just lay a lot nicer on a sanded surface. The layer of epoxy that I'm doing right here is my second to last layer of epoxy, and this is with Fast Cure epoxy. Torch to pop any bubbles, and then we're going to go on with our solution and do the bottom of our tumbler and then go on with our absolute final coat. I know I say this a lot, but just as a reminder, I find that it's better to do the bottom of your tumbler first. That way you're not putting that final coat in jeopardy if your epoxy was to spill over the side. So let this cure completely, and then it's on to solution. This tumbler did not come with a plug, but this can be easily done with acetate. I have a little circle that I ran this through my Cricut, and I just cut this out. I believe the size that I did was 0.7, but I definitely could have gone a little smaller with it. I did want to give that little vibe of fall leaves, so I have the leaves for the inside of the tumbler. I'm mixing some of the Mimosa glitter that we used earlier along with It's Fall, y'all. I'm not mixing a ton right here, just a little. We can always add more, but it's a lot harder to take some away. So I'm just going to mix that on this sheet of paper, give it a little bend, and then put it right into the little hole of the bottom of that tumbler. I have this little fluffy paintbrush. I'm going to encourage everything to go down that little hole, and then I'm going to go ahead and spin this around the tumbler to make sure it's evenly distributed throughout the bottom. For the solution, I really love Suspended from Two Moms Craft Shack, but I wanted it to kind of fall a little more, so I mixed some of the original formula in with it. If you're looking for a ratio, I would say about 3/4 of Suspended, and then the rest was original. When adding the solution to the tumbler, you do not want to dump it all in there at one time because you will get bubbles trapped in that glitter. So I do just a little, and then I go ahead and I move it all around, I wiggle it in circles, and really make sure that all sides of that glitter is coated with the solution. That way it will kind of slide around a little more. Once I get that in, and I keep going a little at a time, I adjust the glitter if needed and add more, and then I top it off with the rest of the solution. This part is a lot easier than it looks, so I'm going to slow down and make sure I explain it to you. If you have any questions, reach out to me. So after it's topped off with solution, I went ahead and there was a plug that I had from something else. I put that in there, dried it off pretty good, and then I shook it around so I can get that glitter really flowing and take a look at it and see if it's falling the way I wanted it to, and I didn't have to adjust any of that solution. If I did want to adjust the solution, I just sucked it out with my syringe, and you can put that aside. It's easy to clean out that if any glitter gets stuck in it if you just run it through a coffee filter. So we're going to set this aside for a little bit, and what that will do is it'll help the bubbles rise to the top, and all the other glitter will kind of flow. Eventually it will settle. Even with Suspended, it will settle to the bottom, but you do want to give it time to rest to make sure that any bubbles will come to the top, because some little clunks of glitter will also kind of join it at the top. If you go to move your tumbler and if there's a patch of glitter that kind of races across and it's in like a clumpy little group, there's going to be air pockets inside of that. The easy way to remove that is you're going to want to overflow your hole, have an empty syringe. You're going to put the little hook of your needle into the bubble, slowly pull back. And as you pull back, and I realize this isn't a good angle, I apologize. As you pull back on the syringe, it will suck out the air, and the overflowed liquid that you put on top of that hole will jump in its place, if that makes any sense. I'll get this done with a darker glitter that's not so busy to make it easier to show to you guys, because I'm telling you, this is the easiest thing in the world. When you do have those areas where the glitter sticks together, then tilt it on a side and get that glitter a little closer to the bubble, and it's going to be really easy, like I said again, to just go ahead and suck the air from in between the glitter. Give this a few different times of getting the liquid in there, making sure it's topped off and letting it sit before you seal it. I found that the longer I let it sit there, I did get a little more bubbles kind of work its way to the top, because like I said, all this glitter will settle eventually at some point. So just let it take its time and come to the top, and it'll be easier to remove. Once I was confident that all of the air that I needed was out, I went ahead and took this over to my sink and I washed it with Dawn dish soap. If you don't have a little plug, you can just wipe it with alcohol. Just make sure that that solution is not going to mix with your UV resin, because they don't like each other at all. There's a decent thickness to this bottom plastic piece, so you can suck out just a little bit of the liquid in that little hole. So that's just what I did, enough to kind of back it off of the edge. I'm putting down just a little bit of UV resin, smoothing it out with my paintbrush, and putting that little circle piece of acetate on there. You're going to want to push it down a little, but not so much as where it messes with the pressure and makes some of that liquid pop up. 4 minutes with the UV light, and then another layer of resin to make sure it's completely flat. That way I can start decorating it and you won't see a little bump from that little acetate circle. So that's on there. We're going to smooth it and hit it with the UV light again. Every time you see me use this UV light, I do about 4 to 6 minutes. So go ahead and get that set. We're going to put down a little piece of leaf vinyl as our stencil. And we're going to prepare it all for spray paint by putting this electrical tape around the edges really close. I do fold it over just a little, and then I take a craft knife and trim it off to give me a really crisp edge in there. And then I take saran wrap and I go ahead and wrap that all the way around the top and make sure it extends all the way down the tumbler. I am going to spray paint the bottom of this white, which I ended up not loving. Didn't decide that until I was finished. And I just want to make sure it's all protected. So just a thin coat. Remove that saran wrap immediately, but be careful that you don't get any of that spray paint onto the tumbler. Remove that electrical tape, and then again I take my baby wipe and I clean this with the rubbing alcohol. And you're going to see me do this a lot. I clean between every step just to make sure that it stays nice and crisp. I'm going to throw down a little bit of UV resin so I can apply my glitter, and you'll see that the little leaf is my stencil vinyl right there, because I pulled it and I was like, wait a minute, I need to drop my glitter first, and then I forgot to tape all that. So I put a little bit of UV resin, I put down my glitter, and then I went ahead, and this is where I'm laying it flat with the little piece of parchment paper to make sure that everything's going to stay put. I then go ahead and take my little craft knife and I remove this leaf. Once again, we're going to go ahead and take our little rubbing alcohol and clean up that edge to get rid of any glitter that may have accumulated along the side. Once you're confident that all that's cleaned up and there's no glitter that's going to be loose floating around, go ahead and put your layer of UV resin, spread it out really well. Clean up your edges around the side again before you hit it, and then go ahead and cure it with your light. After that, we're going to put down the outline to the little leaf. Get your squeegee to make sure it's on there really good. Get your UV resin, give yourself a nice level surface, clean it up, and then hit it with the light, and that's it. There's so many steps to this, but it does come out really, really pretty. Totally worth it. I really hope you guys love this tutorial. Again, hats off to Vanessa with VMD Designs because she's so talented and definitely was the inspiration behind this design. Again, I hope you like this tutorial. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see y'all soon.